So I talk about a quite related topic, namely serial verb constructions in Samoan, under the perspective, with a special perspective on resultative serial construction. So the title is Verbal VP Modifiers and Samoan Verb Serialization. So the observation is that in Samoan, resultative meaning is expressed by a resultative serial verb constructions, in which a manner verb denotes an action that causes a change of state, which is named by the causative second verb. So we have something like Sasolo fa mama e Peter le lao lao. Peter cleaned the table by wiping it, or something like Salamu fa malu e Malia le mea ai. Mary softened the food by chewing it. And in both cases, we have a manner verb in the V1 position, the wiping and the chewing, and a causative verb to clean something or to soften something in the second position. And this contrasts with the resultatives in other languages, for example, in English. And in these languages, resultative meaning is usually expressed by the composition of a verbal and a non-verbal predicate. So in Samoan, both predicates were of the verbal type. So we have, for example, the resultative secondary predication in English, something like Peter wiped the table clean, which is usually analyzed with the manner verb as the main predicate, main verb of the clause that takes the secondary predicate as a complement, which is here an adjective or an adjectival phrase. The table is clean. Then, on the other hand, there is the means construction, something like Peter cleaned the table by wiping it. And here we see that the causative verb is the main predicate, while the manner predicate is just adjoined as a prepositional phrase. So there is a difference in the composition also, in the syntactic composition between the two types. So while we have complementation and resultative secondary predication, we have adjunction of the manner verb in the means constructions. And this is like the summary of the opposition of those two, of the distinction of these two. The main predicate in resultative secondary predication is the manner verb, while it's a secondary predicate in the means construction. And the main predicate of the means construction is the causative verb, the secondary predicate in the resultative secondary predication as a stative result verb, stative result element. We have the different syntactic composition and the different semantic relation. So what I now want to ask in this talk is, what is the morphosyntactic and semantic type of composition in Samoan resultative serial verbs constructions? And to do so, I will first introduce you a bit more into the resultative serial constructions in Samoan. Then I'll take a step back, discussing the main properties of the two types of resultative construction I just briefly mentioned here. And then I present you two types of evidence that, in fact, the resultative serial constructions is part of the family of the means constructions. So Samoan, we already heard something about Samoan today. So I just go over this briefly. Samoan is spoken on the Samoa archipelago in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, but there are also a lot of speakers living outside of Samoa, for example, in Hawaii, and this is where I did field work last year. So my data is actually coming from Hawaii and not from a community that lives in Samoa. The elicitation methods I used were storyboard and picture-based elicitation, which is quite helpful, especially to get more complicated contexts, and but also judgment tasks and sentence manipulation tasks, which are also helpful to check a lot of different combinations of verbs. So, as I've said, the manner, the initial position of a resultative serial construction is primarily restricted to manner verbs or causative manner verbs. So verbal predicates that denote the manner of an action. So we have already seen the first example where we have a simple manner verb, lamu, to chew. So we have something like lamu fa malu, soften by chewing it. We can also have a causative manner verb in the first position, something like fa'i fa ni'i. So make the branch small by breaking it with the hands. Actually, break off here is maybe not a really good translation because it doesn't really show that fa'i actually has a manner component. So it expresses a special type of breaking, basically using your hands and making like a picking or breaking action on some smaller item. So although the initial verb may have a causative meaning as well, it is definitely having a manner component. And lastly, we can also have intransitive manner verbs, something like sing in the initial position. So something like sa pese fa moe moe e malia le pepe, Mary put the baby to sleep by singing. A short note on this, not all speakers accept it, but it seems quite possible for most speakers, so which is why I included it here. In contrast, verbal predicates that do not specify the manner of an action, for example, fa causatives cannot appear. So we cannot have two fa causatives in a row. So something like sa fa mama fa mango e pita le lao lao, which could mean something like Peter dried the table by cleaning it, is infelicitous. So the generalization we can make is that only verbal predicates that denote the manner of an action can function as an initial verb in resultative serial verb constructions. On the other hand, the V2 position, or the second position, is restricted to fa causatives, mainly derived from stative and anti-causative unaccusative verbs, which can be morphosyntactically complex. So the example in 6a we have already seen. So lamu fa malu, we have here the stative predicate under the fa, so fa malu. Then we can have an anti-causative predicate under the fa, so something like tipi fa pa'u. So here fall, cause fall is the second predicate. But we can also have morphosyntactically more complex verbs under fa, so something like kiki fa matala, open by kicking something, where open is first derived into a stative verb, a predicate by ma, so matala, to be opened, and then you can further causativize this to cause to be opened. In contrast, so manner verbs and causative manner verbs are infelicitous in this position. So although fa'i has some causative interpretation, so someone does something that leads to a change of state, is not available in this position because it doesn't really specify the type of the state that results from this breaking action. And the same holds for other verbs like open, for example. So the generalization is only verbal predicates that do not specify the manner of an action, but denote the result state can function as a second predicate. And this table just summarizes the findings that fa causatives only V2, manner verbs only V1. So we have a nice split here. Yeah, now to go into the composition of these two predicates, I first introduce you the model of verbal predicates I use to do so. So adopting a decompositional approach on event structure, I assume that verbal predicates are decomposed into three syntactic layers. So we have roots, the first layer, which are acategorical and just provide the lexical information about the event that is taking place. Then we have the verbalizer, which categorizes the root and introduces an event variable. So the root itself doesn't have the event variable, providing the event variable itself, but only the combination with the verbalizer decides about the eventive nature of the predicate. And then on top of this, there is voice, which is the locus of agentive semantics and introduces the external argument. Now, if we compare the two types of resultative constructions, in resultative secondary predication, the meaning is expressed by the combination of a manner verb and a stative predicate, which is usually an adjective, for example. So something like Peter hammered the metal flat. The interesting thing is that we cannot have a verbal or change of state predicate here. So something like Peter hammered the metal flattened or Peter hammer flattened the metal is ungrammatical. From a semantic perspective, the two predicates, so the manner predicate and the result predicate, enter a causative relation in which the manner predicate causes the result state. So if we assume that hammer just introduces the action or the manner of an event and flat introduces just the nature of a state, then the combination of those two in a resultative construction relates them as a causative relation. So hammer flat means something like the hammering causes the flatness. And how we get this causative interpretation, there's a lot of literature on that, but it's not important for us here. The important thing is that it is not in one of the predicates, but it's in the structure. Syntactically, it has been argued that this is a complementation structure. So the manner verb takes a secondary predicate as a complement or argument. So to summarize, we have the main predicate, which is a manner verb. We have the secondary predicate, which is the stative or result predicate. We have the syntactic composition of complementation and the semantic relation of causation. In contrast to that, in the means constructions, we have a causative predicate that combines with the means adjunct, which is, for example, a means by phrase in English. So Peter flattened the metal by hammering it. From a semantic perspective, this is clearly different from the resultative secondary predication, because the causative relation between two events, or between the eventualities, between the causing event and the result state, is already entailed in the causative verb. So if you have something like flatten here, this means something, there is an event that causes some flatness of an object. So here, the causing event is underspecified. It could be anything, basically. In the prepositional phrase, by hammering, just adds the manner of the action event, basically. And the combination of those two, the manner adjunct, or the means adjunct, fills the empty slot in the causative verb. So basically, the causative relation is already entailed, but then what we do is that the underspecified event variable here, unspecified event variable here, is getting specified by the means adjunct. And syntactically, this is reflected as an modification adjunction construction. So here, the PP modifier merges to the causative verb, which is the main predicate, which also projects in the structure. So here, the main predicate is causative. The secondary predicate is here the manner or means verb. We have the syntactic composition of adjunction and the semantic relation of modification. And this gives us the opposition I also introduced in the beginning. So the question is now, because both verbs or both predicates in resultative zero constructions in Samoan are verbal, is what is the main predicate, right? Because in principle, it could be both. And just to show you that this is like a real problem, or like a broader question, is if we look at other studies on resultative zero constructions. So basically, we see the same split there. In languages like Mandarin, for example, we have something like to wipe clean, and here wipe dry, and here the dry, so the result state denoting predicate, is just a stative predicate. And many authors have argued that these constructions are just an instantiation of a resultative zero secondary predication, just with verbal secondary predicates, and not with non-verbal secondary predicates like adjectival phrases in English or prepositional phrases. But more recently, it has been highlighted that some languages that have zero verb constructions, here resultatives are show instances of the means construction, so show properties of the means constructions. So here, the manner verb is adjoined to the causative verb. And we find this, for example, in Uyghur or Korean or Japanese. And you see this here. Interestingly, in Korean also, the causative morpheme shows up on the main predicate, just like in Samoan. And as we will see, Samoan will be of the same type. So basically, the discrimination between the two types boils down to the argument modifier distinction or to the complementation adjunction distinction. And I will show you now two arguments why we should adopt the adjunction structure for Samoan resultatives. The first one comes from the semantic literature. So cross-linguistically, it has been shown that repetitive modifiers, like again, for example, are often ambiguous with respect to their scope. So in English, again, licenses both repetitive and restitutive readings in the context of resultative secondary predication. So we can have something like Peter hammered the metal flat again, which can have which you can follow up with, and the metal was flat before. So again, the flat state is again there, which is a restitutive reading. We can have a repetitive reading. So, and Peter hammered the metal flat before, where Peter did a hammering flat action or event before. But what we cannot have is a narrow repetitive reading where just the hammering is in the scope of the repetitive modifiers. So something like Peter hammered the metal flat again, and Peter hammered the metal before is not felicitous in this construction. And adopting a structural analysis of, again, the syntactic position of the repetitive modifier determines the respective readings. So in the restitutive reading, it has been argued that, again, attaches low, so here, to the stative secondary predicate. And this position, it solely scopes over the result state in its C command domain. So we get the presupposition that the AP what took place to a prior, well, was true for prior point in time. So the table was clean before. In the repetitive reading, it has been argued that, again, it attaches high to the voice P. So in this position, it solely scopes over the causing event and the result state in its C command domain. So here, the whole voice P is in the scope of the repetitive modifier. And crucially, because the secondary predicate is also in this scope, the repetitive reading always entails the restitutive reading. And this now enables us to see whether this also holds for Samoan. And in Samoan, it has been, or in Samoan, the repetitive modifier toe, which is, again, license both restitutive and repetitive readings in the context of lexical accomplishments, but also resultative serial constructions. So in a restitutive context, like in 22, so something like Peter bought a new table from the shop. At home, he puts the new table in his living room. It is spotlessly clean. After dinner, the table was dirty as it was full of crumbs and sauce. Therefore, Peter wipes the table clean again. So here, Peter wiped the table for the first time, but the table is clean for the second time, basically, or was clean before. So in this context, it is felicitous to say something like "Satoe solo fa mama e Peter le lao lao." Peter cleaned the table by wiping it again. But toe can also have a repetitive interpretation. So in a context that triggers a repetitive reading, toe is also felicitous. So in something like 23, so Peter and his family were having breakfast at their kitchen table. After the breakfast, the table was full of crumbs, so Peter wiped the table clean. A few minutes later, one of his children spilled over some juice, so Peter wiped the table clean again. And here, again, toe solo fa mama is a felicitous way to describe this situation. An interesting thing is also that we find reduplication on the first predicate, which also indicates a pluractionality and therefore strengthens the reading, the repetitive reading of the repetitive action. Now, the interesting fact is that Samoan resultatives also license narrow repetitive reading, in which toe only scopes over the causing event. So in a context like 24, where Peter bought a new table from the shop, at home he realizes that the table had some marks on it. Before he returned it to the shop, he tried to clean it first. He took a cloth and wiped the table, but the table didn't get any cleaner. Therefore, he got himself some cleansing agent and put it on the cloth. He wiped the table again, and now it became clean. So basically what we have here in the context is that the first wiping action does not have an impact on the table. So still in this context, we can say something like Satoe solo solo fa mama e Peter le lao lao, where toe just takes the wiping action in its scope because the cleaning action or a clean state was not being reached before. Crucially, this interpretation is only available in adjoint structures, so something like the means construction. Because here, the narrow repetitive reading can arise if, again, attaches to the means adjunct before event modification of the causative predicate. So basically, before the adjunct is merged to the causative, when an adjunct is merged to the causative verb, toe applies here. So this shows us that Samoan resultative serial constructions are probably composed via adjunction. The second argument comes from syntax, namely the presence of the causative prefix on the result denoting causative, which is quite intuitive, I think. So before, I have argued that var is the allomorph of the causative V hat in the context of voice. So something like voice-driven allomorphy involving voice to V lowering, for example. And this is because var always combines with an agent or an agentive causal. So you can have something like sa fa mama et pita le lao lao, Peter cleaned the table. But if we have a natural causa, which is not an agent, so the wind, for example, the fa disappears and we have a different construction. So sa mama le lao lao il matin. And in complementation structures, something like the V1 takes the V2 as its complement, the initial verb would intervene between voice and the more deeply embedded V2, which would be spelled as fa, and therefore blocks contextual allomorphy because it violates the locality constraints here. In contrast, if we have an adjoint structure, the VP here is opaque to head movement. So voice can move below to the second verb without the V1P or the first initial predicate intervening in between those. So here the locality conditions are satisfied, and we have also syntactic evidence for the adjunction analysis. So just to summarize quickly, as manner adjuncts, the manner verb modifies the underspecified causing event in the structure of the causative V2. So here, like flatten, fa mama has the semantics of entails the causative relation between an event and the result state, but only the result state is specified. The solo just denotes the action or just an activity, and the combination of both in the resultative zero construction. Here, the manner predicate fills the empty slot in the causative predicate. And this means that Samoan resultative zero constructions are more closely related to the means constructions, like means by phrases in English, for example. It's just a summary. And what I have shown today, I think, is that the causative predicate in resultative zero construction Samoan is the main predicate. The manner predicate functions as a VP adjunct that modifies the underspecified causing event, which is already entailed by the causative predicate. And the Samoan resultative zero constructions are part of the means construction family. What can be done, or what are issues to tackle in the future, especially the status of the internal argument in general. So Mike presented an analysis where the internal argument is merged on top of the complex predicate, but in my dissertation, I developed an analysis where it is like in the VP, so in the projection of both predicates, basically. Then the next question is, what is the exact size of the VP adjunct? Is it voice or little v? I think there is some there are some arguments that it's really little v, as I presented here. And then how to explain the distribution of verb classes. Anergatives are not equally accepted in the first position. Middle verbs are general out in both positions. So this is something to look for in the future, maybe. So Farfet Ailava, thank you. And I hope I'm not too much over time. Wait. Yeah, okay.
We have about 7 minutes for questions.
Okay, thanks.
Copa?
This might be related to something that you said at the end. So you showed that again can attach inside this adjunct little VP, and that was really interesting data. So what other elements can you have inside the inside this adjoining little VP? Like, I guess you can't have internal arguments, which you said you had a mechanism for. What about like post-predicate particles or things like that? And yeah, what determines which things can appear there, I guess?
Yeah, so what you can have there is event modifiers, like slowly and quickly. You cannot have internal arguments, which is always realized at the end. You have something like a matching condition, so both internal arguments of both predicates must match, so it must be the same. So something like pure the cup full would not work in this construction in Samoan. What you cannot have is pseudo-noun incorporated verbs or incorporated nouns. You cannot have there, which was quite surprising for me actually. And what I would like to check, but I didn't, or what I now would like to check is whether you can have like voice-related modifiers there, like instrumental modifiers or agent-related, subject-oriented modifiers, like carefully or something like that. But I think these are in general a bit hard to get in Samoan, like in other syntactic or ergative languages. I think there's sometimes a problem. So this is something that would be interesting to look at in the future.
Right, thank you.
General?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi.
Thanks for the talk. This is interesting. I just have a question, and actually you're on the correct slide here. So you talked about the internal argument needing to be shared between the means predicate and the result predicate. But you have here in your denotation that the means predicate is simply a predicate of events without its internal argument. So I'm wondering how you actually enforce that. So is it the case that in Samoan, the means predicate must always be a verbal predicate that itself has an intransitive use? So something like what Kratzer observed in German.
Yeah, so maybe I should have pointed out this in the beginning of the talk, but I basically omitted all internal arguments here because it would just put more complexity in it. So this is just like a not fully version of the semantic denotation of wipe. It would be wipe with the internal argument, with a patient argument. And it's, we cannot have something like Kratzer observed in German. It has always an internal argument, so you cannot drop it in Samoan.
Right.
It's always there, although it's maybe not overtly realized, you still have it in the syntax because these verbs always trigger ergative marking on the subject.
And I guess this relates to, I guess the next question that comes from there is, I wonder what the semantic composition would look like, because your internal argument is already introduced in the result P, right? It's actually not introduced higher up. So from what I'm seeing in your tree here. So how does the internal argument actually saturate the internal argument position of the means predicate? And not the result predicate, but the means predicate,
So in my analysis, which will be more fully laid out in the dissertation, I think, is that you would have here also lao. So you would have two representations of the same internal argument. And then what I argue is that you move both to a higher position for case. And then you have something like ATB movement, which then explains the argument matching as well. But this was too much for the talk, although already this was too much, I think. So. But thanks for the question. I was struggling with this actually a lot.
I think argument sharing is a general problem. It's been observed in English. Mandarin doesn't show it. So Mandarin, you can have unselected objects all over the place. So this is interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Kilu?
Did it again, sorry. I'm not good at this. I just have a quick question about the again, because in a lot of oceanic languages, again is kind of underspecified for a lot of things, it seems to me. So he did this again could mean someone else did the same thing before, or, you know, it could mean a number of things, not necessarily the same thing as again in English. So I was wondering if that might play a role here. Maybe it's just an underspecification of that word, really, that says something is repeated here, but I don't tell you whether it's you know, the same person doing something or exactly this exact event being repeated.
Yeah, so I mean, you pointed a amount of problems, I think, for such analysis, because of course repetitive modifiers in general in Oceanic languages, and of course in Samoan as well, are not really clearly described, right? So especially from a semantic perspective, there are some typological papers on that, which suggest what you have just said, that they behave different to English modifiers. And of course, I cannot rule out that Toe in Samoan maybe does something different here. But the interesting thing is that it can has all readings here, and in work on repetitive modifiers, you would expect something like the narrow repetitive reading from modifiers that directly attach to the predicate. So something like re, for example, in English would have such a can have such a reading where you just modify the event, but maybe not the results. So you repainted the room red, for example, doesn't mean that the room had to be red before. It could have been painted green. This is something you would have to check, of course, whether this Toe can also have such readings in other environments than in the resultative constructions. I think for now it's quite well motivated to use it, because it always appears in this position before everything. So if you look at maybe the repetitive reading,
I'm gonna have to step in and ask you to wrap this up.
Yeah. So yeah, just a short comment is that Toe here seems to scope over the mama here, so it's not directly attached to the stated predicate, but still can modify it. So even if you want to have this derive these readings in a structural sense in Oceanic, you would have to say something about that as well. But it's a great topic, I think, for exploration. Thanks.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.